Good morning, everybody.
Sorry. Good
Good
morning.
morning.
We've reached 10:30. We'll go ahead and call the Stationary Source Committee meeting to order. Thank you all for coming in today. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Our first item is an action item for the BACT guidelines. Al, go ahead and take us in.
Thank you, Chair Benoit. Good morning, and good morning, committee board members. This item is to amend the BACT guidelines and the charter of the BACT Scientific Review Committee. We're once again amending the guidelines. The guidelines were last amended in February of last year as our part of our periodic update, and we're once again before you, providing you with our proposed updates to the guidelines. Last year we had 3 public BACT Scientific Review Committee meetings, in addition to one 30-day comment period that we held to provide the public an information on what we are proposing to update with the guidelines. And the response to comments that's attached in the board package includes all the letters and comments that we received and responded to. This year, we are proposing to amend both major source and minor source sections of the guidelines. That's the policy of layer and minor source BACT, in addition to the layer BACT determinations and minor source. We gathered data from conducting site visits and also within our engineering division, interaction with our staff. And we're also updating the guidelines to be consistent with recent changes to our rules. New rules are being adopted or amended that reflect new BACT, and also trying to make the BACT webpage more interactive and user-friendly. For the overview part of the guidelines, we are referencing a recently adopted policy memo by the engineering department regarding prevention of circumvention of the BACT 1 pound per day or more limit. What it was is, what was happening is facilities would come in for a 0.8 emission increase, and then 3 months later come again for another 0.8. Well, before you know it, they're over a pound a day, and BACT was never implemented. Well, to take care of this issue, we are providing, addressing, and also by reference, including this policy that says there'll be a cumulative increase in emissions over a 5-year period. If one piece of equipment for a facility over a 5-year period increases the emissions for over a pound a day, they're subject to BACT. So we're referencing that in the overview section. In the Part A, which is a policy for layer major sources, we are also referencing the energy-related policy that was adopted by the district in September of 2011. Specifically, Policy 7, which requires new repowered in-basin fossil fuel power plants to incorporate layer BACT, also considering energy efficiency, and is included by reference in the guidelines. For Part C, which is a policy for minor sources, a minor source BACT, again, we're referencing the energy-related policy, and included by reference, and more importantly, we're also updating the maximum cost effectiveness values that for minor source we're required to justify cost effectiveness whenever we propose new minor source BACT. These are going to be consistent to the Marshall & Swift Index, third quarter of 2018. As part of our efforts, recent efforts with CARB regarding AB 617 and establishing a BACT clearinghouse, we came upon discovering that several of our past older layer determinations are not quite up to date. And to be consistent and be able to provide a document that includes the latest layer determinations, these outdated layer determinations, we're proposing to delete them. They'll be held in our files as reference historical documents, but so when the public ever goes to our BACT guidelines, they will see what's current layer and not be wondering, well, why do you have also older determinations? So we're gonna, for these categories, we are gonna delete them, but still keep them in our files for reference historical. These are the categories of equipment that we're adding. For layer, major source, we're adding external roof flooring tank that includes the installation of a dome. All these are actually achieved in practice cases. None of these are new. These are technologies that have been at least in operation for 6 months to a year with source testing and everything, so they qualify for layer determination. Also, so bid for extraction, achieving 30 parts per million NOx for the burner only. Gas turbines is a category that we are now updating with current recent permitted limits, in addition to BACT requirements to showcase that the older gas turbine determinations have been there for like almost 10 years. We are including newer ones for both combined cycle gas turbines, simple cycle gas turbines, fired or natural gas, And since BACT is case specific, whether you operate on natural gas, biogas, or other type of fuel, we're also updating the landfill gas gas turbine BACT determinations there, in addition to digester gas and produced gas. That's the gas that oil production facilities, and all these have, as you notice, different ppm limits for NOx. We're also updating the IC engine portable category with the current Tier 4 requirements in addition to the fire pump. These are all pretty much administrative updates. Not only do we also include determinations that are done within our district, we also look out beyond our district for other determinations that were done outside the state. This is a case that was brought to our attention by our engineering division of a combined cycle large operating system out in the state of Virginia, and they achieved 1.5 ppm CO, which is impressive. And our engineering division adopted that as LAIR because it was a technology that was achieved, it was tested to comply with that limit, and similarly we are adopting it as part of our LAIR determination. This is for the minor source BACT. This is a category that requires a little bit more effort in regard, to comply with the state and health and safety code requirements to make sure it's a technology that is available, it's commercial available, it's technology feasible, and it's cost effective. The first one is a thermal oxidizer that we are proposing for 30 ppm NOx, which is lower than the current Rule 1147 has of 60. We were able to determine that the technology has been achieved in practice, been operated for at least a year or more, and we also included 2 cost effectiveness studies that show that it is a cost effective technology to be implemented. For DFAT fryer is just a clarification on that category to clarify that there's more than just a integrated type of a DFAT fryer, in addition to a integrated type system. We discovered that in DFAT fryer in the world, there are so many different types of DFAT fryers to fry from fish to chips to whatever. So turkeys, all that. Exactly. So we have to be consistent in our listings. And for
Never on a wood patio.
not that. For composting, we're adding a consistency to be compliance with the existing Rule 1133.3 that applies to composting operations. For this boiler, a category between 20 million and 75 million, be consistent with the latest update of Rule 1146 at 5 ppm. Process heater, similarly, we're correcting that. It was a listing of 1146.6.40.1. A lot of times when we update the document, it's a living document. It's so big that once in a while we come across things that we shouldn't have, or we needed probably 6 or 8 pairs of eyes to make sure. So these are categories that we are updating and correcting based on what we did last time. Be consistent to make sure the public gets the correct information. Similar to a spray booth, these are all categories that we are updating to be consistent in addition to the engine. For ppm, all these we verified with our engineering folks and also with other state agencies like CARB, because a lot of time for stationary or portable engines, we mirror their requirements to be our BACT. For Rule 1147, that rule applies to many different types of NOx generating equipment. All these categories you see there are categories that we have in our BACT guidelines, and Rule 1147 contains limits that are lower than those categories currently are right now. So to be consistent with the latest control technology, we are establishing BACT for those categories which would be compliant with that rule. And depending on the temperature at which those categories operate, either be 30 ppm or 60 ppm NOx. And here, the BACT Scientific Review Committee has a charter that describes how the committee is made up of, how we operate the committee. And one of the things that the charter includes is reporting requirements to the Station Resource Committee, which is this committee. Well, we wanted to clarify, it was brought to our attention that every time the committee met, we had to come back to the Station Resource Committee. And I thought, well, that's not really what we meant with the spirit of the committee, because once we meet with the committee, have a public meeting, we propose to the public what we're going to update. So once we have an established and fully vetted and noticed list of proposed updates, we bring to the committee. We have something for the committee to review, comment on, and then recommend it for approval to the board for board approval. So that's what this is just a minor administrative update we're doing. And again, as we try to do every year, every time we update the guidelines, we try to make it more user-friendly and interactive. This is one of the items we added to our webpage for the BACT guidelines to have make it easier for the public and regulated community to identify what BACT applies to them. These links. And key issues that came up over our 3 public meetings. The process to update the guidelines is almost like a pseudo rule development process that we go about to make sure that it's a public process. Transparency of the BACT update process. Well, we had 3 public meetings in addition with 1 public comment period. So we try to make sure the public is aware of what we're going to propose, give the public enough time to comment, and then once we arrive at something that is worthy of bringing to the board, we bring it to the committee also. Next, developing more specific BACT determinations. That is one thing that we always strive for, as BACT is case specific. Try to identify technologies that are unique. To be fair, for example, we're not going to require BACT that is all-encompassing. As we know, there's some certain technology limitations that would require us to be more specific on how we determine BACT for specific processes or control technologies. And finally, promoting policy. We keep on getting questions at our meetings regarding the permitting policy, and one of the things that we mentioned is that's beyond the scope of the BACT guidelines. That's something maybe perhaps at the permitting streamlining task force can be better addressed.
That's lucky.
Like,
That's why I'm looking at him.
No,
We'll be happy to.
Well, thank you. And with that, recommended actions are to determine that the proposed updates to the guidelines and the charter are exempt from CEQA, and approve the proposed amendments to the BACT guidelines and approve the amendments to the BACT SRC charter. That concludes my presentation.
Very good. I'm guessing we have public comments on this item. Do my board members want to ask questions first, or want to go ahead and take public comment?
We have 1 public comment card at the moment, so do you want to take that one?
Sure.
Okay, Rita Luke.
Good morning, Rita Luth, Director of Environmental Affairs for RADTIC International, and welcome Supervisor Hahn to the board. As you may recall, we had a little bit of a hiccup with the BACT guidelines. It took a few years, but we thank you, Board Member Liu, for your motion and for the board's support to galvanize this effort. And I want to say that staff has done a really great job of following through, implementing the board directive, and making sure that now we have a process that we can participate and update the guidelines. And I'm pleased to report that the Air Resources Board recently included UV and EV technology in their BACT clearinghouse, and many of the listings came from the listings in the district's BACT guideline. So we're encouraged. We submitted public comments on additional categories that we think should be considered. And just to give you a brief background, we are very low VOC materials that replace high solvent coatings in areas like printing operations, marine coatings, aerospace. Anywhere you find a paint, you find our products. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thanks, Rita. Any others? No. Okay, that's it.
All right. Any board member comments or questions?
I'll move approval of the staff recommendation.
I do have comments and questions, of course, but I don't know if we want to move forward with that. Is that okay, Ben?
Please.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
First of all, I will say something very positive and supportive, because I know when I start looking at stuff, I get really critical really fast. But this is our second update in 2 years, and before that it took like 10 years. So this is really good. I'm very glad this is coming back, because I do think we have to continually look at this, and I think when you do, you guys are finding that there are things that need to be updated, and that's good. I got stuck going down what I called the BACT rabbit hole, because I think I have a fundamental issue on how I think it's supposed to work, and then how it actually works in practice. Because it really, in theory, should be something that reduces a lot of emissions and avoids emissions wherever possible, but it doesn't actually work that way in practice. When someone comes to us and says, we want to do this, they tell us what equipment they want to use and the process they want to use and the source that's going to be emitting, and then we say, well, this is the best one for it, and that's how BACT is supposed to work. To me, sometimes it seems like there are alternatives that would eliminate emissions or reduce emissions. And I think when I went down this BACT research internet rabbit hole this week, one of the things that came up was like this seemed like a little bit of inconsistent use, and maybe Barbara, you can help with this because you have the institutional memory of it. We talk about source categories, and then we also talk about processes, and it kind of seems like it's inconsistent. In some places we do, in some places we don't, and historically it was an issue and it wasn't. I don't really understand it. It's always been a question to me how broad the category is. So if someone comes in for a power plant and they want a simple cycle power plant, that's one limit, but if they could still generate electricity with a combined cycle, and at a lower level, we don't say, well, you can still generate electricity with a combined cycle, so you should do that. We say, well, here's the best simple cycle. Or, it applies in different things. And for example, like thermal oxidizers, I know that's on here. I mean, I have some experience with cleanup of contaminated sites and vapor extraction systems and stuff. And sometimes the better way of doing it is doing it actually treating those materials in the ground, not pulling them up and sending them through a thermal oxidizer. But that depends on a lot of very source-specific issues and obviously areas of groundwater and soil treatment remediation that we're not expert in. So it's a little frustrating because I know in some cases, like the Superfund site in Maywood, they treated everything they could in the ground before they brought it up and then sent it through granulated activated carbon and then through a flameless thermal oxidizer. That's a very complicated issue, very source specific, and all of these are, but should we even be telling them use thermal oxidizers at all and the 30 parts per million NOx limit, or is there something better where you can not have to have any emissions? Anyway, it's a complicated thing.
Yeah.
Barbara, I guess my first question, and I do have a couple more, is there been this issue of process, equipment, versus kind of the bigger picture use of BACT to say, you should be using UV, EV printers instead of the traditional printing mechanisms?
Well, I think in the past, we've had kind of different approaches to this issue. One thing that we did back in the 80s was adopt a clean fuels policy so that, and we incorporated that in our BACT guidelines, which meant that we wouldn't just say what's the cleanest diesel engine, but we would say you can't use the diesel engines as BACT any longer. So to that extent, we have used that kind of approach of telling the person that they can't use this type of source they've asked in. You gave the example of the simple cycle and the combined cycle engines. I think that's a question of defining the source category, and that those are two different source categories because they have different needs in terms of how they function.
Yeah, there are technical limitations that would.
Not as much anymore as they did in the past, right? I mean,
Well,
there was slow startup with combined cycle in the past, but now they start up very quickly. So
maybe we should look at that again, but that was the.
well, I don't know how many power plants we have on coming in at this
Not in
point.
our to-do list.
Yeah, exactly. I understand that. You have another from staff.
Let me make one point, and you can join me. So we typically will not dictate the type of equipment
Yes.
that the operator
Right.
should use.
I recognize that.
I fully agree with you on the example that you gave, combined cycle versus simple cycle. Yes, the combined cycles are less pollutant. In an ideal world, we would prefer the installation of this, but there are still some differences in the operability of the two systems, even though the differences are diminishing as the technology keeps improving. But we'll still not necessarily dictate to the operator to use the combined cycle in lieu of instead of the simple cycle, because
And that's
Up to
just an
now,
example, you
Yeah,
know, but
it's one example, right?
Yeah.
Or the other example in terms of UV coatings versus water-based coatings or low VOC coatings. Again, the amount of VOC emissions is one of the variable, but the flexibility of the different technologies also is another variable that we cannot fully understand or dictate, to the operator, and we'll leave it up to them to decide. But we are telling them, if you are going to use the UVB technology, this is the VOC level that you have to meet. If you are going to use, the low VOC technology, this is the VOC level
Yeah,
that you have.
I understand that too, that
Yeah.
we shouldn't necessarily second guess but how businesses do their business
Right.
in that regard. But it can be a little frustrating when we're facing the kind of, challenges.
I was going to take it one step further. If there's a pattern that kind of common sense says, we should be moving towards this technology and this emissions level, often we'll start developing source-specific rules.
Right.
Regulations. Exactly. And indirectly, through that mechanism, through the open public process, we start pushing industry in that direction.
In that case, rules established back, especially that
Yeah.
apply to new operations.
The BACT applies to the new replacements, new equipment, new installations, and modifications.
That result in emission.
Right.
Okay.
Get that. Okay, thank you. Couple of other things. I noticed that,
Gentlemen, want to speak?
oh, yes.
Just a brief comment. You mentioned institutional knowledge. I've been here a long time. For one brief window of time, we had a category called basic as BACT. And that's exactly what you're kind of espousing, is that the engineer could look into what the facility was proposing to do and then switch over to a different process that was
Mandated or suggested? Which
It was pretty, well, at one brief time, it was mandated. And then that was eliminated because we, it was basically found not to be legal. And so.
Legal.
That's why I thought Barbara might have something to say about it, yes.
And that's why it was a very brief time, because engineers kind of, would run.
So it was never actually litigated, so I don't know that we.
Yeah, but she won't say it's illegal.
I don't think we can take-
Nothing's illegal, so it's been litigated.
I don't know that it's actually legal, but it seemed like, the benefit was outweighed by the difficulty.
Well, we should have a conversation about that in some detail at some time, but not here at Stationary Source Committee. It seemed to me that everything was based on what was in permit limits and not necessarily achieved in practice. So sometimes you issue a permit and you say this is the level, but then when they actually go into performance, they can beat it. And
Exactly.
I mean, are we looking at what's achieved in practice or just looking at what people have issued in terms of permits?
What we traditionally looked at as achievement in practice is when a permit has actually been issued for a certain level. Because if a source test, if the limit is 5 ppm, and the source test shows they've been
Three or
achieving
two or
3,
whatever, yeah.
which means they're in compliance with the 5 ppm.
Right.
But if a permit is not issued at that limit, for us to take it to the public and say, well, this was source tested and it showed it did 3, however, we permitted it at 5. So our policy has been for achievement in practice to be based on a permit limit in a condition.
And what gets factored in, whether the manufacturers offer a warranty.
Yeah.
If we have the ability to extract a warranty at a lower level, what the permitted level is, then for sure that will get reflected in the next BACT amendment.
And similarly, that I noticed that in some of these, the averaging times were over a
Yeah.
day instead of over an hour or whatever.
Right.
How does that impact are shorter averaging times, which shorter averaging times actually result in fewer emissions? I guess is my question.
Shorter average.
It's a double-edged sword. It can go both ways. So ideally, we want to have as short of an averaging time as possible to the extent we can quantify the emissions through a source test. What is happening, though, as we are pushing towards lower and lower limits, quantification of those limits are through source testing is becoming more and more difficult. In those scenarios, it may make sense to experiment with the longer time frames, because that gives us the ability to push the limits even further down while we are given enough flexibility to the operator to comply with those limits.
Okay.
So we look at both variables in time.
All right, that makes sense to me, certainly. I also noticed that startup and shutdown were not considered in a couple of those slides.
Yeah.
And the question, of course, is, well, if we looked at startup, shutdown, and malfunction emissions, would it actually mean that some other technology would be backed other than, as far as we know, I'd assume not. But we just didn't use the startup and shutdown
That's right.
emissions in the
That was
calculation.
because the permit was issued to comply with
Operating.
limits, besides accepting operating time, startup and shutdowns. Those were exempted in the permit.
I see, okay. So that's how you got to that number,
Yes.
because the permit had that.
Yes.
And then finally, in response to the UVEB questions, staff said they were going to conduct some research on the applicability of some of these technologies to establish a back limit, and there wasn't any specificity as to how much time staff thought it was going to take to kind of figure that out. Do you have an idea?
Well, we looked into what other districts have established in regards to UVEB type coatings.
Uh-huh.
And what we discovered is that they are very, very low emission, but they're
Yeah.
also very specific to, for example, for different types of printing industries. For like the paper printing, for plastics. And we're trying to identify, and the key thing, a lot of those happen at minor source operations. And
So I'm specifically talking about this letter here, November 2nd, 2018, the responses to comments in which staff basically said in a couple of areas, we're going to do some research and see if this applies. And I just want to know, is that going to take 2 years? Is it going to take a year? It's going to take 5 years? I don't want them hanging out forever trying to.
the challenge is establishing a cost. A lot of those are operations at minor source facilities, and for us to bring that to be part of BACT, to comply with the state law, health and safety code, we have to establish that these are actually cost effective, although they've been in operation.
I'm
That's
going to
gonna be a challenge.
assume that the industry will cooperate on trying to
Please,
get
yes.
you that data. Ideally, how long would it take in a worst case scenario? What do you think?
Next update?
Next update?
3 years.
2 years?
We're trying to do these annually.
If the data
A
is
year or
there, we should be able to move quickly. But without the data,
We're looking at-
unfortunately, we cannot
Exactly.
pull numbers out of thin air.
Exactly. We need the data first.
And I will save you nitpicking every backed limit proposal, but Mark, my board consultant, has some very specific ideas on what some of the levels should be for some of the different things, and I just encourage you to talk with him about that, because he peppered me with a whole laundry list of them. So, thank you, and sorry for getting so far into the weeds on this, but it's a pet peeve of mine.
So I made a motion.
Very good. Great questions, Dr. Liu, and I'm glad you get into this, and obviously Mark too. Thank you guys for getting into that. And I can tell you we're down a rabbit hole when you're talking about emissions coming from stuff in the ground that we need to clean before we pull it out. Clearly, you're down a rabbit hole at that point.
Yeah, it can be done. Electric resistance heaters, really good bugs that eat up the contaminants. That happens.
How about
too.
rabbits?
Yeah, a lot of bioremediation. There are options other than just pulling it out and burning it off.
Right.
Yeah, bugs.
All right. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Wow.
Very good. Roll call, please.
Dr. Liu,
Aye.
Supervisor Hahn. Mayor Mitchell,
Aye.
Supervisor Rutherford,
Yes.
Councilmember Benoit.
Aye.
Motion passes 5 ayes.
Great. That brings us to our next item, the update on the development of outreach materials for Rule 1147. Michael.
Good morning. Very busy today, so I know everyone's here to hear my presentation on pamphlets. Okay, great. Let's get started. So, Rule 1147, as you know, this is our rule that regulates miscellaneous NOx sources that don't fall under already established NOx regulations, so ovens and dryers, heaters, fryers, etc. We had a previous amendment back in July 2017. The purpose of that amendment was to lessen the compliance burden, basically lengthen the compliance time for certain units of equipment, such as ones that are less than than 1 pound of NOx per day, and also exempting those that were actually being utilized less than 325,000 BTU per hour. The applicability we've got listed here goes to things from manufacturers to owners, distributors, et cetera. And again, not to overlap with any of those units that are regulated elsewhere. There was a board resolution back then that asked us to conduct some outreach and come up with some creative ways to do that. We broke that up into 2 phases. One phase is to come up with some kind of very easy to read, user-friendly pamphlets. So one can understand if you were in some, if this is applicable to you, what exactly do you need to do? And then the second part was a more in-depth analysis and guidance for complying with the rule. And that'll be a guidance document that'll be coming up. Okay, so in this phase 1, and I believe you guys have some of these pamphlets already that should be attached. I brought some of them here. We've been working on pamphlets. We decided to break these up into 3 pamphlets, so it's sort of an easy path for people to go to. For example, those that are with units that are emitting less than 1 pound a day, those emitting greater than 1 pound a day, and then a special one for spray boost. The reason for that is actually our largest body of affected units under this particular rule is spray boost. So we want to dedicate it specifically to that. And I know Dr. Liu is going to harass us for the time it took. However, to create a pamphlet is he gave it away down the hallway. Thank you. So I'm prepared. But it's one thing when you sit down and you think, okay, create a pamphlet, no problem. Let's lay it all out there. Well, sometimes us engineers, we turn around and it's all, as Susan always says, very linear. Stop being so linear. And so, I can't help it. I was born this way. Anyway, so we then decided to create like a pamphlet that's, people always ask questions. So FAQs. So boom, we decided we should have some frequently asked questions and what are the answers to those questions, guiding them to things like email links or phone numbers, etc. And then we thought, of course, colored pictures, because some people don't like to read, just like to look at pictures. So we wanted to make sure we satisfied them. And then more importantly, inside, we tried to create some sort of graphics, depending upon those requirements, to make it sort of an easier read, flow charts, or maybe tables or things like that, color coordinated, etc. So anyhow, to move that along.
Can I see one?
Sure, absolutely.
I want to see the spray one.
Okay, yes. There we go. This is the one you want. Refolded, very important. These are just prototypes, so we'll have those in more glossier hard stock, et cetera, as we send those out to the public.
Printed with a UV printer?
Of course, with compliant ink. Of course, I'm sure your next question was going to be how is this going to be distributed. We will have a full distribution plan, whether that's through our compliance group to distribute those. We'll have those online. Our LPA group is going to be, of course, as you know, is always the front line. We'll do email blasts, etc., and continue to distribute this information. We are planning to have these pamphlets done in multi-languages. The next step will be our compliance document. We'll dive in again a little deeper, probably some flowcharts, compliance paths. We've already been asked certain questions like, what if I had a unique burner like the ribbon burners, kind of a unique, how do they get source tested? Some certain questions like that. So I think those are the kind of things that we're going to be addressing in that compliance guidance document. We've been working on that this year and hope to get it done by the end of the year. And there's the update.
Just one other comment is,
Sure.
we did, looking at Bill, we did get input from key industry representatives.
Well, we're about to get
as
some
we're
more.
developing. Okay.
Great.
And
Hopefully
full
that's
disclosure,
positive.
Susan is an engineer, so she understands.
I am an
And
engineer.
comprehensive though, so.
But she doesn't always think linearly?
She can
Yeah,
do both,
she
which
can
is a
do
very
both.
rare
Yeah, she's
talent.
multi-talented,
So,
Mr. Chair, we do have one comment card.
Great, let's go ahead and have that comment now then.
Okay, Mr. Bill Lamar. Funny how you might have a comment on this, Bill.
Yeah, I wondered what Bill was going to say about this.
He didn't check support or against it.
No, we didn't check support or against.
Well, did you ask him what should go in the brochures? That's the question.
We did.
Actually, Dr. Liu, if you want to print these on UV, it'll cost you 3 times as much,
Really?
but it can be done.
Okay.
No, Rita says no.
Rita says no. You guys can have that debate over lunch.
Hi, good morning. I'm Bill Lamar, Executive Director of the California Small Business Alliance. If It's hard to believe that it's been 10 years since this rule was adopted, 7 years since it was first amended, and 559 days since the board approved the Second Amendment. 559 days ago, as part of the board's approving the rule, Board Member Mitchell directed staff to act with a sense of immediacy, your word, and reach out to burner manufacturers and encourage them to submit their low NOx products for certification in order to break up the monopoly that staff created by relying on only one manufacturer for paint booth burners. Moreover, she urged staff to offer financial incentives from a fund of some $147,000 to offset the cost of certification. If this was done, we were never advised. Board Member Mitchell also asked staff to prioritize their outreach to facility owners whose equipment is regulated by this rule. This item has been pending for 559 days. That's a year and a half. And staff is telling you that it will be another month before these 3 pamphlets are released. But the accompanying pamphlet, the compliance pamphlet, is still nearly a year away. I want to go on record by saying that several of us did meet with staff last July and September to review the comments on the 3 pamphlets, and I can tell you that I was pleasantly surprised at the wording and the appearance. I should also say that these are not the pamphlets that we reviewed and we're supposed to review again before this briefing. These are the pamphlets, and they're significantly materially different. The third item in Board Member Mitchell's direction to staff was to extend the period of compliance for the under a pound a day low NOx burners to 35 years of the date of purchase. While this was accomplished in the final rule, we find it grossly unfair and a compliance overreach to require the owner-operators of these historically low-emitting paint booths to repeatedly prove that they're under a pound a day limit by source testing on a biennial basis at a cost of $7,000 or more per test, and having their paint booths, their primary source of income, inoperative for a day or more. This could be $15,000, $20,000 for some shops every other year. To illustrate my point, recently approved Rule 1469 mandates that hexavalent and chromium platers only source test every 5 years. Since staff has been somewhat reserved in engaging with us over the past 559 days, as Board Member Mitchell originally requested, and since Rule 1147 is scheduled for yet another amendment, we implore and direct you to resolve these few remaining issues before the next amendment. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Bill. Does staff have any responses or?
We'll meet with Bill and we've had some changing of staff on 1147 retirements, shifting, but let's get back together and talk about, all the different issues that you laid out and where we are with it. What we sent you and what we had discussed on the pamphlet was sort of the black and white, just the straight language, and then we gave it to our graphics department to.
No, these are all in color, Susan.
But it's different because that was just like the basic graphics, and then they added more. But we can hold off on distributing it if you want to take a look at these brochures. Why don't we just give these to Bill? And then we'll schedule a meeting next week, or if you want a little bit more time for us to circle back on those.
There you go.
I have.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah.
A month sounds like a long time, but if you take these complicated technical documents and you want to translate them into multiple languages, it really needs to be done with care. And then you've got the distribution, the production and the distribution. So, we're trying to move this quickly.
Sure.
I think it's a good product and it's a really helpful thing. But if you guys want to have another look at that and see if you have any comments, I'd be happy to look at that.
No, I appreciate your workload, but remember the business community has the same workload you do.
Yep.
So we're
Sure.
operating the same way. Thank you.
So the other thing to look at was, Bill made this comment about the source testing for paint booths every other year. Can we take another look at that? Maybe that is, most of these operations are small businesses, and that's kind of a hefty cost for them every other year. And then also on the brochure, I'm going to assume you're going to be working with Bill to put together the information that he thinks is vital that isn't in our brochure. If there is something there, I would hope you'll be working with Bill on
Definitely.
ironing
Right.
out those differences.
Sure, and as well as the guidance document.
Yes.
A little bit too on the thought process on the brochures was that this was like sort of the first release for 1147, but we wanted to use it as a template for other rule makings that we're doing to have the similar outreach. So inspectors, when they're going to different facilities, they can just hand these out. So we're trying to put sort of, looking forward, it's like, okay, how do we want to lay this out so we can use it for other projects? 1469 does have other elements besides just the source testing. We refer to it as parametric monitoring or monitoring of certain parameters of the control equipment. Whereas it may be that, these facilities don't have some of those other types of additional requirements. So that's why we can extend the time period on those. And it really was for the smallest of the small facilities that they got the longer compliance time on those source tests.
And what about working with the other paint booth manufacturers to try to get some competition in the
Yeah,
price?
we'll work with engineering and we'll work to see where we are on that in terms of the number of burner manufacturers on that.
Yeah, because I remember we were concerned about having a monopoly.
Right. And just ask you to take a look at that source testing biannually and see whether there's any wiggle room for us to
Sure.
extend that.
Yeah, and the cost estimates of where does it really cost them?
Cost
$7,000 plus whatever time they're down, which could be 15 or 20. I mean,
You said one day.
yeah, one day, but still,
Yeah.
I mean, that's revenue, right, you're down today.
I'll have to go back to look at 1147, but as I recall, I thought there were other options besides the source test where the manufacturer could provide information. So let me go back
Might need a new
and
pamphlet
let's
on
just
that.
make sure. Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
On those
As
different-
long as it doesn't take 18 months.
Okay.
Any other board member comments, questions?
Yeah, it's information.
Thanks, Mike.
All right.
Nope. All right, we'll go ahead and go on to the summary of proposed rules 110 through 3006. I'm not going to read all those. Michael.
I understand why. Good morning. A brief presentation on a suite of rules, 22 in total, that regard our public notification and public notice. This past summer, we sponsored Senate Bill 1502, which modernizes our communication with our stakeholders. It regards the email notices or the mail notices that we send out as part of our rulemaking activity. In addition, both EPA and the Air Resources Board provided directives regarding newspaper notifications for our permitting program. So we're bringing all these rules together to update our communication methods, and it's going to affect several of our activities. And I'll briefly
Play with it.
provide details on each of these activities and how they'll change. So for the public notification, our current practice, in addition to publishing in the newspapers, is to mail out notices for the public workshops and the public hearings to all of the stakeholders. And with this Senate Bill 1502, we'll be allowed to email those stakeholders that provide us email addresses. As part of the public workshop, stakeholders recommended that we ask for the stakeholders to provide us the email before we switch to going straight email. So we are doing that as part of this process. We're taking that recommendation, and we'll continue to use the mail until we get the email addresses from them and the go-ahead to switch to email for those people. As part of this process, the Senate bill also requires us to have a procedure where we'll collect the email addresses and their preference for notification. And so just to provide you some information about that, and this will be incorporated into our appendix for the staff report. We will be developing an electronic infrastructure that will allow us to capture the email information that we have and associated data with their facility. and then allow them to choose what type of communication they prefer, whether it be email or regular mail. This will be done through our website, and it'll also be done through our mailing notifications, where we'll have something in the mail that basically says, if you'd like to go paperless, here's how to do it. For our early rulemakings, especially the smaller ones, what we'll be doing is, if we can confirm with the stakeholders that they prefer email, we'll go ahead and do that. For the larger ones, it'll be more difficult, so we'll continue to do this by regular mail. And what we're hoping is that by 2022, with this outreach campaign through the webpage and the mailings, that we can go ahead and switch over to mainly email notifications for the rulemaking, except in the cases where they've asked that they continue to receive that by mail. For our Title V and new source review permitting programs, there's a requirement that we publish in the newspapers. The EPA and Air Resources Board, as I mentioned, recently directed that we can do this through e-noticing, or basically putting it on our webpage. And so we will be doing that, and we actually already are putting that on our webpage now. We also, for the general area that they're impacted, there is a mailing requirement. We'll continue to do that. But we will also hope to add a feature that we will be able to allow people who are generally interested in, maybe not in that area that's impacted, to be able to let us know that they would like to be emailed anytime one of these actions occur. And so we're going to include that as well. For public notices for our hearing board cases and our invoices, our own rules dictate to us that we need to send it by mail, and so we'll be providing the option that we can send it by mail or email. Simple as that. And then there are several other rules that have noticing requirements, and these rules are relatively older, and they generally have to do with offsets. They also require newspaper notification, and we'll be doing that by web only. The suite of rules, there are 22 rules that will be impacted, and one of them, I'm sorry, inadvertently is listed twice under the first and second columns. Rule 3006 should only be under the public notification for new source review in Title V. These 22 rules, they're administrative changes just to modernize communication, and that's all that we're doing as far as that. And then finally, these suite of rules are set for public hearing to be heard in March. With that, that concludes my presentation, and if you have any questions.
I have a question.
Very good. Supervisor, please.
I'm finally understanding something besides the email and a newspaper. So, in terms of public notices, currently you've been advertising in local newspapers, depending on the area that's impacted. So you might have been advertising in some small newspapers and community type newspapers.
General
currently?
circulation. We publish on general circulation.
So you have not, so you're only been advertised. I haven't read your notices, so I don't know, but so you've just been like big newspapers. Is what I'm asking.
Yes,
Right.
big newspapers, but if we are in San Bernardino or Riverside, we do advertise in local newspapers as well.
I guess that would be my only concern, and I didn't know if now that you're allowed to not advertise in a local newspaper, moving to email or mail, is this with an environmental consideration in terms of how newspapers are printed, or is it convenience? I think about a lot of these smaller newspapers that might have depended on a little bit of the revenue coming from these notices and,
These are mostly real regulatory notices, like a rule or a
right,
public
but don't
hearing
you
or
have to pay
things.
for the advertisement?
We pay a
Yeah.
lot for the advertisement.
That's
I
what
think
I'm
there's-
saying.
There's other ways
So-
we can inform, excuse me, the other ways we can inform.
I know,
when it's
I'm actually
important for
taking
local.
up for the small newspapers.
So, but we
I'm
can
taking
talk
up for the
with
small
them.
businesses.
We can talk to them and they can run a story, or we send out press releases that they can put stories in, but we have not traditionally been advertising.
I want to respond to, there's two types of notices.
I know that,
is-
one, I see two
One
to the
is
permit holder.
rules and one
Right,
is permits. On the rules, the state law still requires newspaper notice.
That's correct.
And it requires newspaper notice in newspapers in all 4 counties.
Okay.
So we will continue our
Okay.
practice, and
so you're only,
it's only the permits that we now have the option, because EPA actually.
not about
adopted
public
the
hearing,
rule.
not about public hearing.
That's
Correct,
correct.
it'll be about
I didn't
permits.
get that from the presentation.
That's correct, yeah. And there are, for CEQA notices and for rule notices and hearing notices, the circulation is a little bit different in terms of the requirements under state law. So the CEQA notices go to the LA Times, very, very expensive notice.
Right.
And it's a very tiny little strip in the legal section, but that's our requirement under state law. And then,
Yeah, we did not change CEQA at all, so
Right.
that is
CEQA
gonna
notices,
continue.
rule notices, and the newspaper requirement is still the same. We're still gonna be noticing the same way.
What we did change for the rules was, instead of an individual snail mail notice to people who might be interested in the rule, we now will have the option, as Mike was explaining, to use email if the person requests we use email instead of the.
And how would a local newspaper who maybe is not traditionally on your list to be noticed in, maybe get on the list?
We are trying to be sensitive to the cost, so we often get offers from the newspapers,
Right.
and that becomes one of the variables that allows us to determine which newspaper we want to
Okay.
go with. But the ultimate objective is to reach out to
Public
the public,
notice,
so,
yeah, so the public can read it, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I have 2 questions.
Sure.
The
Please, Dr. Wu.
first is I have an assumption, I just want to check to make sure it's accurate. You know, when we had paper notices, we have this really thick record retention policy that, as any good bureaucracy would, it's totally mind-numbing. But I've looked through it before, and I know for paper notices, we have maybe a policy, and we probably have some sort of electronic or online record retention policy. Are we going to retain these for an equal amount of time as we would otherwise? Do we think?
Yes,
You've read the record retention policy too?
not recently, but I have read it a few times.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. So this would not change our record retention.
Yeah, so whatever notices that we would retain for whatever period of time, we're still going to do that. We'll do it in electronic format instead of hard copy or whatever. That's kind of what I want to make sure, because,
I mean, that's a fair assumption. In fact, I may argue, without putting ourselves into trouble, the electronic means allow us to almost pretend
forever
as
and
indefinitely.
indefinitely.
Yeah,
But
right,
we have a
exactly.
policy on how long, and I'm sure we probably have an electronic record retention policy as part of that now too, I think. Anyway, that was one question. The other is in terms of reaching out to specific communities, when we do that, have we explored using something like Nextdoor to do that? Because everybody in my community is on Nextdoor. And if we want to tell people about something, I know that the police and sheriffs, they actually, as government agencies, can post things onto Nextdoor. I assume as South Coast AQMD, we might be able to too. But if you want to reach people through email in a specific community, there's no more effective way, at least in my community, than using Nextdoor.
We'll have to look into that. I don't see
Yes.
anybody from public affairs here that we might know, but we can look into that.
I think especially for community meetings or town halls, it's like, would
Yeah.
make sense to.
Right,
Right.
right. I think
That's a
it's a
good
really
suggestion.
effective way of
Mhm.
getting in touch with people in very specific communities.
Yep, we'll let Derek and Fabian know.
Make work for Derek, that's a good idea.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Any other board member questions?
Oh, yeah. Brutal.
Yeah.
All right, with that, we'll move on to the last item, the status report on Reg 13. William Thompson.
Good morning. I'm here to present a status report on Reg 13 New Source Review, and my boss has suggested that I keep it very short.
Good idea.
Yes, but informative.
We
Okay,
are in
so
compliance.
we come to the board twice a year, one a preliminary report and one a final report. This is the preliminary report for year 2017. And I'm gonna go through these and go directly to this graph and just say everything's fine. We're still positive for all accounts, and so there's nothing really other to report. And I'll be happy to take any.
Very good. Any board member questions or public comment on this item?
No public comment.
Board members, any questions?
Looks good.
All right.
Thank you very much.
We also have our written reports that are attached. Any questions or comments on any of those, anyone? Any other business by our board members? How about general public comment?
Oh, we have, under general public comment, one comment by Dan McGivney.
Good morning. My name is Dan McGivney of Southern California Gas Company. I'd like to provide a few comments on proposed amended Rule 1403, which is asbestos. SoCal Gas has been meeting with staff for some time, but we've met 3 times since the December Stationary Source Committee and to address many of our concerns with the rule. And we have another meeting scheduled for next Tuesday. So we appreciate the working with staff and they're listening to our needs, I guess. We appreciate being able to engage on this issue, but we want to stress that the current proposal will have significant negative impacts on our day-to-day operations. We first raised this issue in November comment letter that we sent to Dr. Fine, and have continued to raise this excuse me, issue at subsequent meetings. The proposed amendments right now go above and beyond the federal NESHAP requirements in regard to small renovation jobs less than 100 square feet. Under the NESHAP, small renovation jobs are exempt from the notification and 10-day waiting periods. SoCal Gas performs many small renovation jobs every day as part of our system O&M and to repair leaks. These small renovation jobs are typically 1 to 2 feet in linear distance and length, are in a trench, and are assumed to be and treated as if they were asbestos, when we start to go in and do the excavation. So we're prepared to treat them as if they are, whether it ends up being that way or not. The current proposal requiring notification and wait times will increase our compliance costs and delay our work on these small jobs. And again, we have many jobs, these small jobs, every day. So we respectfully request that the February 1st amendment hearing be delayed so that we can continue to work with staff and resolve these remaining issues. Thank you.
And second comment card came in, and she didn't write it down, but I'm assuming it's the same issue. Cindy Parsons.
Hi, I'm Cindy Parsons, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Yes, Rule 1403 is still, there's still several unresolved concerns, and these are actually concerns that have come up very recently at the recent working group meeting. And so we also would like to request a delay in consideration of adoption of these amendments so that to allow the utilities more time to try to work with staff to try to come to some sort of resolution. And the new issues do pertain to underground piping. One of them has to do with requiring an on-site inspection of underground pipe and the difficulties that that presents. The second has to do with if you do not physically inspect the underground pipe, such as if it's in a roadway and you don't want to create a hole in order to inspect the pipe before you file your notification, then you would have to file a procedure 5. There's cost involved with that. And that is something that there was no economic analysis done for these rule amendments. And so those 2 new requirements, the on-site inspection and filing procedure 5s for underground pipe, for any project underground pipe, that is an additional cost that I don't think has been rightfully considered. And then the other thing, we've spoken previously about the need to have a pre-approved or a standard operating procedure for asbestos cleanups to streamline the ability of a utility or a contractor to go in and clean up spilled asbestos material as quickly as possible, which is required under OSHA. However, staff is still unwilling to give a pre-approved plan for cleanup of asbestos spills, and that's something that we feel is important. And so we keep bringing it up because it is something that we really would like to see at various locations, pre-approved plan for cleanup of asbestos spills, so that we could act promptly as required by the OSHA regulations and not have to stop and file paperwork every single time. So just there's a few unresolved issues, so we would like more time to try to work through and come to a agreeable resolution on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I comment?
I don't know, you have to ask council how much you can talk about this issue since it wasn't on the agenda.
I think it'd be fine to, staff wants to make a brief response.
Well, the first question is,
can the board members?
oh, my first question is, what authority does this committee have to ask for a postponement? It's set for hearing on February 1st, right? That may be a legal question.
Since that's not on the agenda.
Yeah.
We can't take action.
Can't take action, so if you raise their request at the board meeting.
Or resolve all the issues prior to the board meeting.
We can
That's our
certainly
goal.
try to do that.
Yep.
Because I can tell
That would be
you,
preferable.
it's going to be a contentious board meeting.
Already with the HF, yeah.
Okay, I think that's it. in terms of-
Faye, is there any way to ask for a motion to add something to the agenda that with an urgency, or is this meet that urgency requirement where we could do that so we could discuss this with a 2/3 vote, or are we just unable to bring this forward at this time for any other discussion?
I don't think it would rise to the level of an emergency. But
Okay, with that, what I'll do is I'll talk to the chair of the board and see what we can do. I won't be at that meeting, but I do hear the concerns of industry, and I do want to make sure we're not taking something to the board that's not ready to go. So I'll speak with the chair and let him know that we probably need to bring this back and hopefully get through one more working group meeting, but I will talk with him about that, and that's, I think, the best we can do at this committee level at this point.
And staff certainly is hearing the comments and is taking that into consideration. We'll speak with Wayne and with the other staff as well. So we'll try to work things out, and we'll let you folks
And I know the
how it's
stakeholders, I mean, I met with one of them already, so I know that they're actually meeting with board members too, so.
And I've met with them.
Yeah.
And I've gotten some phone calls as well, but it's just, I don't want to take something to the board that's not ready to go, and hearing these concerns, these are types of concerns that I don't want to have to hash out at the board meeting, so. All right, thank you for those comments. Do we have another public comment card, or was that it? After
No, that's it.
Very good. Thank you, everyone, and we'll be back here again next month on February 15th. Have a good day.
Thank you.